Good morning, everyone. This is Jim Zuffoletti from OpenQ. I'm your co-host this morning for our webinar series. We are talking today about the challenges and opportunities associated with social business and the means by which to approach a business case, if you will, for going social with legal and regulatory officials within your organization. Today's webinar will be 45 minutes in length. We'll spend about 15 minutes at the beginning talking about the social media landscape. We'll do a quick demonstration of some social compliance technology, and then we'll close out at the very end with some Q&A for people who have some questions about the business case that they're trying to make in their organization. Again, our goal associated with the discussion today is to convince you it's safe to go social and to empower you to have those discussions with your internal stakeholders who may be concerned about legal, regulatory, or compliance. Just some quick housekeeping items for our presentation today. The first is we will be in presentation mode, which means that all audio will be on mute during the presentation and demo and Q&A. We will keep the chat communication capability open, so if you have any questions or comments about the audio or visual, or want to submit any questions, feel free to do that via the chat window. Finally, if you're not able to get to your question associated with the Q&A, please feel free to email me directly after this presentation or during this presentation, frankly, and we'll get back to you with our guidance to the best of our ability associated with this, what we think is extraordinarily important issue for the life sciences industry. So let's jump into the presentation. Just a quick kind of introduction about OpenQ before we jump into the issue of social compliance. OpenQ is a provider of software and information that sits at the intersection between life science companies, healthcare companies, and their outside social networks. We're a believer that the best way for organizations to be effective is to embrace their internal and external social networks. And we're a big believer that one of the burdens and challenges that must be overcome in order to unlock that social value is by embracing the concept of social compliance. OpenQ has a long time commitment to enabling the compliance needs of companies. We've been in business for 8 years and have supported hundreds of audits and dozens of corporate integrity agreements that our customers have to abide by. We're a frequent participant in social compliance dialogue. We also have an active partner network because we believe that social is a phenomenon that exists in a network of companies, and you can see some of the companies that we work with. And as I referenced previously, we focus on both the technology and the research that goes into social business success. So let's talk a little bit about social business, and let's start from the concept of external benefits and internal benefits that companies gain from this. We're a big believer that social, as it's come aboard as a technology phenomenon and as a business phenomenon, is grounded in the basis that there is tremendous value to be gained from companies that embrace social business throughout its many different shapes and colors that they can throughout their enterprise. And here are a couple of examples of areas that we've seen companies effectively employ social business practices in order to achieve better business outcomes. On the external basis, there's some strong evidence and strong experience in companies in terms of patient benefits, in terms of building better recruiting, getting better messaging out to patients, and getting better monitoring in place to understand if there are any patient adverse event issues and the like out in the marketplace. Another major area that social business represents a substantial benefit for companies has to do with lowering costs. And you can see some of the areas here that we've seen based on our experience that companies have been able to attack the cost structures of their organizations, including increasing their reach through lower marketing costs, the ability to get a better sense of effectiveness in terms of communicating messages beyond the enterprise. And finally, we've put together a more restricted list of other areas of external social benefits that companies have been able to achieve in terms of communication associated with patient-reported outcomes and in managing some of the communication aspects of their REMS programs. At the same time that companies achieve external social benefits, there's also a lot to be gained from companies working operationally with social business. And I should say parenthetically that when we talk about social business, we're talking not just about the concept of engaging your external social network, but to think of your internal organization, your internal employees and collaborators as a social network as well. And we've again seen companies achieve tremendous opportunities and tremendous benefits by embracing social business as a means of increasing growth, to lower the cost that they have of doing business by doing things like increasing research productivity, reducing the cost of communications through various means of effectively embracing social collaboration. And again, we see some other benefits in terms of the ability to handle data and to protect intellectual property more effectively. So there's a lot of benefits to be gained from companies embracing social business. And let's talk a little bit about breaking down the concept of social business, and we'll provide a couple of frameworks for you before we start talking about risk and addressing risk. One of the things that we'd like to talk about at OpenQ is the concept of social intelligence. Companies that are embracing social business often talk about building their IQ associated with their social activity. But one of the areas that we like to distinguish is between the three basic activities or behaviors that companies embrace associated with social. The first is the concept of listening and monitoring. So social becomes a powerful phenomenon for listening for treatment trends out in the market, potential side effects, the ability to look for and respond to off-label issues. At the same time, companies can use social business as a means for research. We've seen a lot of companies think about their social outreach as an extension of their market research activity, and they're able to get some very interesting and very quickly gained insights that way. And the third and often overlooked component of building social intelligence is the concept of engagement. Ultimately, social is built not just on the concept of effectively listening and understanding that which is being discussed in the market, but effectively engaging people and responding to the questions and creating discussions and the like that are really going to generate future insight and future engagement between you and outside HCPs or between your organization and the patient community. Another framework that we like to share, and you'll see this becomes a compliance important concept in a couple of minutes, is the concept of the fact that social doesn't exist in one flavor or color in terms of the types of social networks that companies build. We often make distinctions between three primary types of social networks or engagement channels, if you will. The first is the concept of internal social networks. Many companies are embracing social business platforms like Yammer or Jive or Salesforce Chatter as a means of effectively collaborating internally. And we call those internal social engagement channels. Likewise, there are companies who are extending into the extended enterprise concept. So in the life sciences space, they may create private KOL communities or private communities with their investigators. And you can see some of the types of activities that people embrace associated with those private communities. And then the final area of social business that companies embrace, which is the one that gets the most discussion, is the concept of external engagement. How do I engage my patients? How do I engage my HCPs associated with third-party communities or large social communities like Facebook? So what are companies doing online? Well, we wanted to share with you some data that we received from Gartner as part of a groundbreaking study that they did earlier this year. And one of the things that we walked away from in terms of this overall presentation from Gartner was that at the end of the day, social is not necessarily about doing different activities. It's more about doing the same business activities, but in a different realm, which enables you to do them more efficiently and more effectively. So as you look at this list of activities that people are using social networks to accomplish, you'll see that there's a lot of commonality with what you're trying to achieve on a day-to-day basis. Now, to dive in a little bit further, one of the things that we thought we would do is talk a little bit about what you see in terms of social activity in one particular arena, and we've chosen oncology. Those of you who read the New York Times probably saw an article with a great treatment of some new research into, or I should say newly public research associated with lung cancer. And so oncology continues to be a hot topic of discussion in the social community. And you can see from the statistics that we've described here on the page that oncologists as an organization or as an entity or as a group of individuals represents a real population that companies have an opportunity to effectively embrace socially. More than 75% of the oncologists that were surveyed by Manhattan Research back in 2009 indicated that they look to gather information about their practice online, which creates a real opportunity for online social engagement. And you can see on the right-hand side a not even extensive or exhaustive list of different social communities that in part or in whole particularly cater to the oncology community. So one is left with the overall conclusion that in this specialty, which is pretty indicative of other specialties, there's a strong desire to go social. There's a strong amount of social networks that are already in place. And the only missing piece is organizations and major life sciences companies getting more active in terms of their engagement with these social communities. So why is that happening? Well, what you see here on this slide is an example of the many types of risks that when we work with organizations, we hear again and again as the reason why companies are not interested in going social. And they range from concerns about the proper handling of off-label comments and off-label questions to concerns around confidentiality and trade secrets that might be released, to concerns about general conduct areas like the use of inappropriate language, to more specific regulatory concerns about areas like adverse events and HIPAA. So there are a tremendous amount of potential risks that are out there, and the actual environment associated with risk has shifted tremendously over the last couple of years. If you talk to someone in the life sciences industry about the concept of organizational risk years ago, what you would probably find is an emphasis around the concept of operational success. And what we've come to the conclusion now is because so much of what we do as life sciences organizations lives outside of the organization itself, our concept of risk needs to be inclusive of all of those stakeholders who are not just conducting themselves within our company's walls, but our extended enterprise and collaborators, the HCPs we work with on a daily basis, who are not part of our company, but whose activities are intrinsically important for our overall success as an organization. So companies who are looking to address this risk need to think about some major skill set challenges that they have in terms of gathering the data that they need from a social perspective, and we'll get into that in a minute, effective engagement, and to address the challenges that social business represents in terms of calling for new policies and procedures. We've got a real cycle of concern that's playing itself out within the industry right now, where the organizations start with concern about the regulations that are in place and the fact that there's a lack of clear guidance for companies in terms of how they can engage social. Then that regulatory concern becomes legal and litigation concerns, and I'll share some information in a second in terms of the cost of potential legal violations in a moment. That also expands into internal company policies that are needed to enforce those regulations within the company's walls, and ultimately translating to costs. So there's a cycle of activity that we're seeing playing out in the life sciences industry that's really standing in the way of broad industry-wide adoption of social activity. I talked about cost a moment ago, and so in order to talk a little bit about cost, let me talk about some of the specific aspects that we've seen in the market. And this comes from an article from The Economist. And it talks really about the costs of compliance violations to the life sciences industry. Now, many of you are familiar with some of the fines that are listed at the bottom of the screen here. But what I want to highlight is the middle section, which is it's not just about the cost if you are found guilty in a circumstance. It's also about the cost of supporting an investigation. So the companies that are most effective in terms of addressing their compliance needs are the companies that have an infrastructure in place that if they are called on to respond to a potential investigation, they can do that efficiently and effectively. Finally, before we talk quickly about making the case for social, I want to point out the fact that risk, from our perspective, is also an enterprise challenge, meaning companies that are looking to embrace social collaboration need to think about not just the regulatory challenges that they're facing, but the fact that as they have different stakeholders within their organization and within their extended enterprise, there are different aspects of risk that they need to address. So if you're building a researcher community or a patient community or a community with caregivers, you're going to face risk associated with going social, and you need to be clear that those risks may be idiosyncratic to that nature of that social network. So how does a company make the case for going social? So we wanted to present you with a couple of different thoughts that we had about that in terms of both business practices as well as technology requirements. And then I'll turn it over to my co-presenter today, Ottavio Freri, who will take you through a technology demonstration. So first, let's talk about the business aspects of making the case for social. So the first thing that we advise customers when they're thinking about social is, while there is not certainty around all social practices, and while there hasn't been a lot of specific guidance about social practices, there are fairly clear sets of guidance regarding general communication expectations within the industry. And this harkens back to the point I made a few minutes ago, which is social isn't necessarily about a new set of activities that companies embrace. It's just a new way of doing business by which you can embrace those existing activities. So as we advise companies to think about their communication practices, we often circle back to those underlying issues that companies already have existing communication processes and procedures in place. The second concept that we often talk about with companies associated with social business is the fact that industry players are already starting to wade in. We see a lot of press coverage associated with companies in major pharma or major med tech who are embracing social business, companies like Sanofi Aventis or AstraZeneca, who are receiving very strong positive press for the fact that they're wading out into the social world and looking to receive real benefits from engaging their networks and extended enterprise more effectively. Second business practice that we often talk with companies about is whenever you're making a recommendation about a potential marketing initiative or about a new business initiative, compliance, the concept of compliance needs to be embedded from the beginning when you're making a proposal. So if you're looking to embrace social for a marketing initiative or a communication initiative, one of the bullet points, one of the slides, one of the core processes that you're going to be incorporating is that concept that this is how you're going to be able to take care of compliance needs from day one. The second concept that we often encourage companies to do, especially if they're early in the social game, is that if you're making the case for some sort of social engagement, either internally or externally, that you really propose whatever your compliance scheme is as part of an overall systemic and enterprise approach to compliance. So you might be concerned about creating a patient community, for example, around inflammation today, but ultimately what you need is a mechanism and a procedure in place for how you'll engage with any patient or third-party community. The final thing that we often advise companies on is again to forget about the concept of social unto itself, and to remember at the end of the day that social is a concept that is way beyond the company's control in terms of total ability to control, so that you as an organization may not be able to control the pace of when your organization is expected to go social. So even if you're not embracing a lot of new programs, you need to have the processes and procedures in case now. The second basic area that we like to talk about for organizations is the concept of social channels. So as an organization, companies are often thinking about going social as one monolithic endeavor. And often that's the starting and the ending point for organizations, because they immediately think about all of the potential risks associated with all the different social touch points. And we often counsel folks to break down their social activity into individual channels. So you may have internal social business. You may have an internally sponsored external community, such as a KOL community. You may have an engagement plan associated with an externally sponsored community, like Patients Like Me or Facebook. And we often counsel companies that when they think about breaking down the social challenge, they need to break it down into these individual types of channels, because for each channel, there may be a very specific set of compliance needs. The second area that we advise companies to think about in terms of social activity and breaking down the compliance challenge is to think in terms of policies. Often companies think about all the different things that can go wrong as one big blob of activities that will cause them challenges as they engage social business. And what we find is that because different social channels and different geographies and different functions have different policy needs, it's important for companies to break down what are the privacy concerns we would have about going social. What are the branding concerns? What are the anti-corruption concerns that we have? So it's a means of breaking down what could be considered an insurmountable compliance challenge into the pieces that can be individually addressed. The final area of business practice that we talk about within organizations is the concept of access. This is related to the concept that I shared with you a few minutes associated with the concept of social channels. When a company builds a social engagement plan, one of the things that they'll notice is the type and amount of engagement that they can enable may differ based on what community they're engaging. If you're within your company walls, you may very well be able to support an open and extended level of engagement back and forth between the employees within your company. Whereas as you grow further and further into the world beyond your company walls, you may still want to foster some degree of engagement, but you may reasonably put in some limitations in terms of the amount of communication back and forth or the type of activities that you'll support. Now, one of the big breakthroughs that we've seen in terms of the area of social compliance is that companies now have at their fingertips the ability to bring on board technical capabilities that will allow them to embrace social business and to do so in a way that protects their compliance interests. And what we've got here are 4 key areas that if you are thinking about embracing social business, you ought to be thinking about what are the technology capabilities that you could have at your ready in order to take on those compliance challenges. The first is the concept of collecting social business feeds. Quickly, we find that companies are quickly understanding that when you go social, it's not just about a Facebook presence, it's not just about what you do on Twitter, it's about the fact that you have many, many different social feeds that are out there. And the first challenge from a compliance perspective is assembling them all together into one corpus where you can archive them and track them as you need to for your compliance needs. The second compliance mandate that technology can take care of is analysis. One of the things that companies immediately identify when they go social is that the volume of messages that they are seeing spikes incredibly. We've seen some companies who have talked about tens of thousands of individual messages that they may receive on a weekly basis that they now have responsibility for monitoring. And so the second component that technology can enable is the ability to analyze those social posts for potential compliance violations using text analysis and language analysis. And we'll demonstrate some of those capabilities in a minute. The third area that companies often see is that when they're looking to enforce social compliance, they need to get a sense of the comparative levels of risk that they're willing to tolerate. A company may see responsibility at a very high level, obviously, of taking on the challenges of HIPAA compliance or compliance associated with the pharma code or compliance associated with managing off-label comments, but may make a different decision regarding risk for whether or not inappropriate language is introduced into a social feed in a third-party setting. And the final area of technology, where technology can be a real assist in terms of companies looking to go social, is to enable the follow-up process. Often companies will receive a post on a third-party site or in an internal social business platform, and they'll need to have a means by which they can track that, evaluate it, follow through, and remediate it. So the fourth key capability set is associated with investigation of potential violations. So those are the four major capabilities, and I'll run through them quick in terms of examples. When we talk about collecting social channels, it might be chatter or KOL or an HCP portal. We talk about the concept of policy analysis. We're talking about evaluating messages that come in terms of potential risk for false claims or competitor brand claims or language that suggests an anti-kickback language. And when we talk about the concept of supporting inline investigation, we're talking about the ability to get messages together into a dashboard setting where they can be drilled down into evaluating the individual risks and then appropriately remediated. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-founder and co-presenter, Ottavio Freri, who will take you through a demonstration of Safeguard before we close out the Q&A.